Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this inaugural session of the Toronto Global Forum 2020. My name is Brian Tobin. I'm Vice Chair of BMO Financial Group, and it's my honor to kick off this first session, which in keeping with the main conference theme, will be focusing on creating a resilient economy. Now, we've got a terrific panel of experts lined up to give us a global perspective on this most important question. For me, the question of how to create a resilient economy goes right to the heart of globalization in the world economy. Clearly, the pandemic that we're all living with is front and center and is affecting everything we do, including the fact that we're talking to you by video conference rather than from the Royal York Hotel, the fantastic Royal York Hotel in Toronto. The human toll of the pandemic is depressing. So far, more than 1 million people have perished, and of course that number continues to rise. Today, however, we're going to focus on the economic toll, which has been unprecedented. The global economy will contract by about 4.4% in this year of COVID 2020, according to the latest forecast from the IMF. Next year, the IMF optimistically predicts world growth will bounce back into positive numbers. They say about 5.2%. According to the forecast. But even if that materializes, it will bring global output only to a scant 0.6% higher than it was last year. And left in the wake of all of this will be a giant debt bill that we have collectively rung up trying to fight the effects of the downturn. The IMF says countries have increased spending or cut taxes by nearly 12 trillion so far, which represents 12% of global GDP. And as the Financial Times reminds us, that compares to the stimulus package of the G20 after the Great Recession, which was only a measly 2% of GDP. And yet China appears to be a standout. Already bouncing back from the recession, China will record positive growth in 2020, albeit only about 2% to be sure, but still positive, unlike many European economies, which will be down closer to 10%, which brings me to global trade. There's no question that trade issues are front and center. They're certainly front and center in this U.S. election. The fact of the matter is, whether you have Mr. Trump returned or Mr. Biden elected, which does seem more and more likely, that trade battles between the United States and China are not going to go away. And of course, that has attendant impacts on the world writ large, and perhaps provide some opportunities for some other parts of the world to step into the breach. So I'd like to start with this superb panel with a question about China. Our panel today brings perspectives from around the world. I'd like to begin our conversation with someone who's closer to that question than most, certainly from a physical perspective, and that is the governor of the Central Bank of the Philippines. Governor Benjamin Diokno was just appointed governor last year, but he's been heavily involved in the Philippines' economic development throughout his entire career, serving most recently as the budget secretary. Governor, we've all been watching China flex its muscles in recent years, and nowhere is that more evident than the South China Sea. China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative is an important source of infrastructure spending in your region and could be an important part of the stimulus to recovery. I'd like to ask you on behalf of our many viewers, what do you make of the growing trade tensions between the U.S. and China and the role that China can play in bringing about the recovery that, of course, the whole world needs? Governor.
The U.S. and China are the two largest economies in the world, and the role they both play in the recovery of the global economy will be monumental. For that to happen, however, they should embrace multilateralism, not isolationism. As an economist, I truly believe that trade is welfare enhancing. So should the trade war between the U.S. and China persist, and as you mentioned, no matter who the next president will be, no one wins. U.S. loses, China loses, and the whole world loses. China has an important leadership role to play, however, in the recovery. The presence of a vaccine and its distribution globally will play a big role in the recovery process. Many developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa may not have the resources to buy the vaccines. Since China is ahead in the development of the vaccines, it would be nice if they can provide the financing for the distribution of the vaccines to the neediest but poorest countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa.
Governor, you have the Philippines has a particular role, I think, it can play in that it has long been a traditional ally of the United States. It has a increasingly warming relationship with China, notwithstanding tensions in the South China Sea. How do you see the Philippines playing the role of bridge to help these two economies, these two governments, have a better rapport?
Well, I think you're putting too much pressure on the Philippines. We're both close to China and U.S. They are our major export destinations and import sources for the country, with bilateral trade with these two economies accounting for more than 1/4 of our total good exports and imports for the period 2010 to 2018. The direct impact on Philippine exports could be manageable as the higher tariffs was directed only between the U.S. and China, but the continued trade friction could affect overall investment sentiment and increase caution and uncertainty in the global growth prospect, which eventually could affect the country's external sector. The extent of the impact of this trade war between China and the U.S., whether positive or negative, depends on the industries or products targeted by the said measures.
Thank you, Governor. This seems like a good spot to turn to Afsena Beschloss, founder and CEO of Rock Creek Group, but also known to many in the audience as the former treasurer and the CIO of the World Bank, and more recently as a partner of the Carlyle Group. Let me get her to give us her take on the current state of international trade and the role that trade will play in a resilient recovery. Afsena, the decades-long move toward globalization seems to have stalled, and that's putting it politely, of late, due in large measure to the sharp turn the U.S. has taken under President Trump toward a more nativism policy. Within the last week, a lot of us have been watching very closely the polls. We see the U.S. is coming down to the wire. It appears more likely that an upset's possible, so I'm not going to ask you to comment on the election itself, but I'm going to ask you whether or not Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden's elected, is U.S. policy likely to change very much in terms of trade policy, the dispute with China, and can we really get back to business as usual and back to vigorous growth if this trade war continues apace?
It's great to be with you, Brian, and at least virtually in Toronto this morning, and with the governor and other colleagues on this panel. As the governor was saying, the role of trade continues to be extremely important. And at the same time, I think the lessons learned compared to when all of us on this panel had our first course on economics, where comparative advantage in trade was seen as the best way to go about trade, we have all learned one or two things about trade. And I think trade on equitable terms seems to be reasonable, but it may not have been happening quite in those terms. So my sense is that as we are learning through this COVID situation, as we come out of it, we will have learned that countries will be continuing to do global trade, and there will be beneficiaries, as you said, maybe not just one or two big economies, but actually some diversification, let's say North Asia, to places like the Philippines or other countries like Thailand or Indonesia or Vietnam will be beneficiaries of what is going on today. But the second part of this is that we also need to produce things locally. We've learned during COVID that while having global chains, supply chains is very important for some real necessities and urgent goods, You need to have your local distribution lines set up. And I never forget when I was a student at Oxford studying economics, the great book that Amartya Sen wrote about famines. And famines in India were not because of lack of food, but because of lack of good distribution systems. And I think part of what we have seen and part of the suffering we've seen because of trade has been because the supply chains did not adjust very quickly. Going to the second part of your question in terms of the impact of what is going on in the US on potential different economic and trade scenarios, I would say that as you said, in the last few weeks, there is a very interesting change in the markets. What you saw earlier is every time we saw a CARES package go in, we saw the markets go up, the expectations of big fiscal push by government was enough reason. And the fact that the central banks all over the world, but in particular in the US, pushed out all the money into the markets did impact equity markets, particularly in the US. But the other side of it, which is, I think, very interesting, is the last few weeks, as you were saying, the potential of a blue wave is increasingly being taken into account as the more likely event. And as you can see, people are assuming that with that, we will be more likely to have a green economy. There will be a lot more infrastructure built in the US, which is both good for job creation, which has been a big problem for certain groups, services, and other areas in the US and globally. And that this very big fiscal package in the US and the potential of a blue wave would be also expansionary for the rest of the world, including emerging markets and US's trade partners. So it seems at this moment that is the more likely scenario. That's the scenario that markets are taking into account. And they're also taking into account that even if taxes were to go up somewhat for corporations and for the very wealthy, that would not be enough to impact really the very expansionary impact. Obviously, I think you did touch on the big points about huge amounts of debt being created and the huge disparity also, Brian, on debt creation in the US, Europe, and in China, where much less debt has been created. And I think the last point I wanted to make is that we're coming, as we slowly go into the winter, the dark winter, as Vice President Biden mentioned on his last debate last week, and will eventually, hopefully, come out of it in the spring. The big issue is that you're going to have the West, US, and Europe mired in huge amounts of debt. You're going to have China have much less debt. China is spending this time developing its digital currency, it's developing its green economy, it's developing its infrastructure, and so on and so forth. The rest of the West, because of the very minor fact that people did not take wearing masks very seriously, is much behind that. And last but not least, emerging markets are now much more in debt to China than they ever were. And so when we talk about debt reduction or debt negotiations, it will be not just about multilaterals such as the World Bank or IMF or banks in the West, but China that will be a big decision maker.
Thank you very much, Afsana. Let me go now to Stan Bergman. Stan, your company, Henry Schein, is the world's largest provider of healthcare products and services to office-based dental and medical practitioners. And you've been at the helm for more than 30 years, so you've got a great vantage point from which to watch world trade evolve, and indeed in your own business and more globally. You've operations in more than 30 countries around the world, including China. So it would seem that multilateralism is almost part of your DNA. I guess I'm really curious to know, how do you react to the course that we're on? As Afsana has just said, as a provider of healthcare products, you're now seeing people debate about the need for assuring that essential products are created at home as opposed to being imported from somewhere else in the world. I'm thinking about the shortage of PPE and ventilators at the start of the pandemic. Is this a positive trend from your perspective, or a negative one? That there's more of a sense of we're only secure if we build it at home, if we distribute it at home, and we have control of our supply chains?
Brian, an excellent question. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel. I'd like to pick up on a point that Afsaneh mentioned earlier on. We need a global supply chain plan for PPE. Hopefully the vaccine will work, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all. We've had the basic flu vaccine in place for decades, and it's effective to some extent, but I don't think we can assume that the vaccine is going to end this coronavirus, stop it. And I think we also have to be prepared for the next epidemic, the next pandemic. And in that connection, viruses do not carry passports. They will not be stopped with visas. It's a global issue, and we need a global infection control, a sepsis control plan focused around PPE. If we don't do that, we have not learned anything from this virus. In 2015, at the World Economic Forum, we formed the Pandemic Supply Chain Network to sit beside CEPI and to sit beside the Gavi program. Having said that, we failed miserably in ensuring that we had product moving around the world. Yes, there is value to having capability and capacity for manufacture of product in certain countries. We're not going to have gloves made in every country. We're not going to have masks, the right kind of masks, and wipes and sterilizing solutions made in all 200 countries around the world. So I'm a big proponent, obviously, of trade, global trade. We need to take the lessons we've learned from COVID, namely that infection control at the local point is important. China, Korea, Japan, and a number of other countries did that. And at the same time, we have to ensure that PPE flows in no different a manner to in which oil flowed in the 70s and was dealt with. So it's complicated, but we can't sit back and say just simply because masks are inexpensive products to make, that we can just wait for this to be resolved. This is an urgent call to deal with PPE now, and governments can't do this alone. They need to do it in combination with other governments around the world.
Let me ask you, Stan, given your unique perspective as a supplier of medical goods, quite literally all over the world, and let me just declare myself, I'm a former Minister of Industry, or equivalent to your Secretary of Commerce in Canada. I'm a former Premier. Obviously, you'd like to be able to say that you can build everything that your country needs in your own country. But the reality is it doesn't work, as you just said, and it's not practical. I'm personally very concerned by the ebbs and flows against globalism and the mindless attacks on the other as opposed to building it at home. I think the world is going in the wrong direction. But let me ask this question. Given what you've just said, which I believe to be true, that coronavirus is not going away anytime soon, how prepared is the world for the medium to longer term haul battling this virus? And are we going to see more shortages of supplies as they're needed? We're seeing numbers today that are peak numbers literally all over the world. So the demand for certain goods will get much larger in the weeks and months ahead. Can we meet that demand? And if we can't, will that lead to a greater call of doing it at home, even if we're shutting down global supply lines to do so?
Yes, Brian, you're asking a very, very important, in my view, from where I sit, a very serious and critical question. I don't want to get into politics. American election will be decided hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But it is clear that yes, masks are readily available today, much more than they were available. At the same time, there's no regime to ensure that the quality of masks is good. So that has to be dealt with. On the other hand, I don't want to cause panic here, but it takes quite a while to build a glove plant. And 70 or so % of the gloves come from one country. I believe that country, Malaysia, has handled their responsibility well. But it is a fact that 70% of the world's gloves come from one country. Again, they've done a good job, but it takes a couple of years to build a glove plant and to ensure that there is raw material in adequate supply. So I am very worried about the state in which we have these jump balls. We know them in the investment banking world, investing world, but in PPE it's dangerous. Different countries go to different plants around the world and throw around money, and the wealthy get the product and the poor don't get the product. Poorer countries, let alone the quality product. So we have an issue. I don't think we're going to solve it on this call, but in 2015, we issued a warning at the World Economic Forum that the world needs to deal with PPE in a logical way, just like the world has dealt with oil and other matters. So I am very, very worried that the world is not focused on this particular issue, the availability and supply chain of PPE. It's much more than masks. It's much more than gloves. It's cleaning solutions and other products. We dealt with it correctly in Ebola, a little bit late, but when the US, and I believe it was the UK and a couple of other countries sent over cleaning solutions to West Africa, we stopped the Ebola. Look, vaccines are important, and we will ultimately have vaccine capabilities. Don't know when, but until vaccines come, the only way to stop pandemics and epidemics from growing is through infection control.
Thank you. Let's look at this issue from a from a different perspective, that is the prospects for building resiliency. Let's talk about what people have dubbed the circular economy, moving away from the take, make, waste toward a more sustainable model. And Guy Cormier, you're CEO of the 5th largest cooperative financial group in the world, indeed Canada's largest. And sustainability is something that you and Desjardins have embraced with great enthusiasm. In your view, how is our shift to a circular economy being helped or hindered by the developments we've been discussing this morning?
Well, thanks, Brian, for the question, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I think the discussion we're having right now is really, really interesting in a way where it's not one or another. It's one and another. I think we need global economy. But if we look at the last few years before the pandemic, there were already a lot of discussion about the collateral damage regarding globalization since 1980s, people, climate change, inclusivity, poverty, yes, a rise in the medium class around the globe. But still, there were a lot of panels like that and discussions about we should think of something else for the future because there's too many left out right now regarding the last 30, 40 years. I think the pandemic is another very sad event that will bring us with more clarity regarding what kind of next decades we want. And yes, we will continue to need globalization. We will continue to work countries with others and more cooperation to face all the challenges that we have to face. But at the same time, I think we have learned in the last 6, 12 months that there's some solutions, there's some issues that we have to face and must face. Yes, with this concept of circular economy. There's too much waste right now with some productions, and the waste for a company could be kind of goods for another company who wants to work in a different field. So how do we use circular economy in a way where not only internally in a country, but how can we have a stronger productivity for some companies because they use some products that are close to their activities geographically, less waste regarding environment impact. Also, the fact that with globalization, there's a lot of traffic to bring the goods from one company, one plant to another. So isn't it a way right now to have a real discussion about, yes, we must continue to have globalization, but at the same time, can we learn? And it's not only buy locally, but it also buy locally can bring what kind of positive effect on communities, on sustainable growth, on climate change. I think if we want to build a resilient and a stronger and a more better job economy in the future, we should really learn not only from the pandemic, but the last 3-4 years and try to see what kind of economy we want to rebuild together.
Given the closeness, obviously, between Canada and the United States, by far the vast majority of our products for export go to the United States every day. And of course, our friends in the U.S. don't always remember that 25% of everything the largest economy in the world produces for export actually comes to Canada. We're the single largest contributor to U.S. export success. Can you give us some examples of where you think, on the one hand, we can sustain the drive toward a competitive, efficient global economy on the one hand, but on the other hand, do things, as you just said, a little smarter, a little better, that reduces waste?
Well, I'll use the example of, let's say, hydroelectricity. Hydroelectricity that we have a lot in Quebec, where we can use a cleaner energy let's say, to work in different plants. Look at the electrical vehicle that we want to build, and we're heading in this direction. How can we build a supply chain where there's less waste and we use all the, let's say, the capacity? Let's say a country like Canada, at least Quebec, hydroelectricity. How can we promote, even in USA, on this concept of circular economy, so you have less waste, you use an energy, you use resources that are close to USA, that are in Canada, and you use this hydroelectricity, this electricity that can be really powerful for new vehicles, and you have this concept of working together. Agriculture could be something interesting. Another example too, a lot of waste with agriculture, but all this waste could be so resourceful for other products to start a new chain. So just quick 2 examples that are quite, and there's already some pilots and projects really interesting in these 2 industries to reduce waste, less impact on the environment, increase in productivity, and less transit between the resources because you are in North America. So I think there's something to look at right now on that side.
Thank you, Guy. Governor, can I come back to you? Guy's just talked to us about climate change and about the need for action to seriously address climate change. We've seen all over the world, including in your part of the world, a commitment to do just that, although you do see in North America and to some extent in Europe, the naysayers who say there is no climate issue that we can realistically address will point to Asia and say, look at Asia, they're not doing their part. Why should we do ours? Because it won't make a difference anyway. I don't agree with that. I think Asia is making a real turn toward sustainable action toward climate change. But I want to ask you, has the pandemic and the pandemic response put actions toward managing climate change on hold in your region? And is that a sustainable approach?
Oh, I think even before the pandemic hit us or hit the world, many countries are already geared towards that issue of sustainable growth. We have to tackle climate change. Unfortunately, there was this movement on the part of, for example, the U.S. U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and that sent a wrong message. You know what? One thing I noticed about this pandemic is the absence of the global leadership, absence of the U.S., absence of the G20 in this regard. They should have climate change is around and will still be around. And so on the part, for example, of the Philippines, we've been pushing for green financing, and that's taking the cue from the Bank for International Settlement, PIS, also very strong on that. But again, going back to the global leadership in this particular crisis, IMF has done its job. Asian Development Bank has done its job. The Bank for International Settlement is also has done its job on this. But unfortunately, you look at the capacity of the World Health Organization. Of course, it's hamstrung by what the U.S. did. They held the financing, and also the WTO has been stymied by trade wars and protectionist policies by some countries. So while there's leadership during the global financial crisis from the U.S. and the G20, that is sorely missing in this particular episode. And so that is a major handicap for the global concerns.
Let me ask this question. If the U.S. is missing and its traditional leadership role is not being played, who is stepping into the breach? If not the U.S., then who is stepping up to play a leadership role, Governor?
That's the big question. No one at this time is stepping in. At this time, this is worse than the global financial crisis. I think you'll agree with that. Yet no one has stepped up to provide leadership, because we really need global coordination. We have to work together if we want to emerge from this crisis stronger. You know, this problem has taken what I call the nature of a global international or global public good, right? This cannot be solved by just one country or one community. We have to act as one.
Well, Afsana, I think this is a call for you to step into the breach and participate in this discussion, given your current work at Rock Creek and your work in your investments in sustainable investments, but more importantly, your background at the IMF. I mean, the governor has just said something, I think, which is incredibly powerful, that the U.S. has withdrawn the United States from its traditional role of leadership at times of crisis like this, but nobody else has really stepped effectively into the breach. Where does that leave us, given that Stanley's described this as a larger health challenge than perhaps people yet realize, with a lot more challenge yet to come? Where should we go from here?
So you're absolutely right. And I think, as the governor said, this issue of countries being coordinating at the highest level for health is something that did not happen, right? I think one of the problems we have, apart from this whole tradition of mask wearing, which is common in Asia because there have been pandemics, and outside of Asia, where it seems to be associated with taking away one's liberty to wear a simple mask. Putting that aside for a second, the interesting thing is that this is, as the governor said, the first time where both on climate and health, the U.S. has not been a leader, but also when it came to health, it was every hospital fighting for its own. It was every city fighting for its own, every country fighting for its own. So that's made everything into a much less coordinated, but also much less smart way to produce goods and to distribute them. And that problem has not got resolved, as you said, and nobody has stepped in. So again, you were asking me earlier about the potential of, how the economy would be impacted. If there is a blue wave, at least, what we have heard is that in one scenario, there will definitely be a lot more coordination and going back to the allies and working together. In the other scenario, we will be sort of on the same course as we are today. So very different courses. China obviously has stepped in somewhat, as I mentioned, not just on debt, but originally with providing some PPs to various countries or friendly communities. But that has not been enough in terms of really dealing with the global issues. Going back to your issue, I think, Brian, in terms of sustainability, what was fascinating, as you said, at Rock Creek, we've been investing in sustainable areas, including clean energy, including in health, in education, in affordable housing. And during COVID, and I expect post-COVID, those are areas that have done particularly well, will continue to do particularly well for all the reasons that the governor and Guy were saying earlier. And Dan mentioned the issues with one country producing so much of the gloves that we're all using. And, having some more diversification may or may not be good, but thank God that, they've been responsible in terms of providing it without gouging everybody else. But, you can't always rely on those kinds of instincts, and that's why this cooperation is important. Coming to climate, I think what is really interesting is with or without the Paris climate, what you see now is that the next generation of the youth, and I think you have some sessions, we have some sessions at the conference later on the future, are going to not take sort of the business as usual. I think they will not be investing in companies that are not sustainable. And we already are seeing a much bigger impact on company CEOs. You heard about this from the BP CEO, for example, a week or two ago, when he said that they want to be an energy company. They want to reduce their carbon emissions. And you're hearing the same thing from many energy companies. So what is not being done politically is being done by business and by the next generation. So I'm quite hopeful, Brian, that sustainable investments will continue. For example, as I mentioned, the intersection of technology and health, technology and education. Those are the areas that are the biggest growth as we speak. But when we come out of COVID, you're not going to go back. This conference may be partially remote and partially in person. The governor may or may not want to travel each time for the longest distance, whereas, let's say, for some of us who are closer, we might travel. So all of us are going to change our life. And some of the technology that we've developed for education, health, travel, and conferences and other kinds of things may stay with us. So as a result, this idea of sustainability, I think, is here to stay. It's going to stay important with or without the political decision making.
Let me ask you, Stan, given your comments earlier, which I would hasten to say don't cause alarm, but do challenge us to be at least awake about coronavirus and to dismiss this idea that if there is a vaccine, then the problem's gone, disappears in a very short period of time. What should we be expecting in terms of the requirement of the planet to stay vigilant and to stay tuned? And how long should the social and economic restrictions that we're now living with be with us? How long before we're back to so-called normal?
So, Bob, a very, very good question, Brian. I'm not a public health expert. I can't give you an answer as to when, but I think it's longer than 2021. There are many different vaccines that are in process. It's not like the flu vaccine where it's just a matter of determining the strains, and even that doesn't work. But, I sounded, Brian, a negative warning in terms of global supply chain and availability of PPE. But I now want to be just quite optimistic. I agree with Afsane's statement that young people are going to not allow the world to continue this way. I don't want to put words into mouth, but that's my words around the statement that was made earlier on. Furthermore, I'm very optimistic about business leadership. I think one thing is very clear as a result of the pandemic, and it started a little bit before the pandemic. Business leaders, and I'm talking now, taking a look at the Fortune 500 list, 1,000 or so leaders around the world, are far more aware that companies, business of companies, is no longer business only, and that companies have a bigger role to play. And in that context, I'm a big proponent of public-private partnerships. We saw CEPI and Gavi make a big difference in vaccines. I believe companies will get together, global companies, to try and resolve these supply chain issues. We need government collaboration. We need academia to collaborate. I think in the United States, in a very narrow sense, once FEMA got involved, and I think this was the case in a number of other countries around the world, at least the PPE availability was dealt with. Of course, the education on the importance of gloves and wearing a mask, for example, we leave that to another time for the history books to decide what was done right and what was done wrong. But I really am optimistic that the next generation, the millennials, have it in their bones to drive ESG investing, to drive D&I, in particular the I part of D&I, not only the diversification, but the inclusion part. I see this throughout large companies today. And so I believe this notion of stakeholder capitalism, the idea of public-private partnerships, will advance this issue. But it is hard. I think it is very difficult to say when this will be resolved, whether this public crisis on masks, PPE, social distancing will be resolved. Very hard to tell. I just don't believe personally. I believe personally that a vaccine is not going to resolve this. Just make it all go away overnight. This is here to stay. And if it goes away with corona, which of course we all hope it does, we need to be aware that there's an epidemic around the corner and a pandemic. If it doesn't happen, great. We need to be prepared. Public-private partnerships, and I believe that business will come through, and so will the younger generation. They will push us to.
Stan, I want to just build on that last comment of yours with ask you for another response, perhaps a brief one before I go to Guy. I mean, you're basically challenging with your statement, and I certainly welcome it, the notion that business is disinterested in the broader social, economic, global issues. It's all about what's the tax regime, what's the regulatory environment, full stop. The rest of it we're not really interested in. And in fact, it's interesting because the market seems to have priced in, to some extent in the United States, a blue wave. And perhaps surprisingly for a lot of people, no great disruption, no panic, notwithstanding, Biden's plan to focus on sustainable development, focus on climate, bring about a tax increase for those who can afford it most, and address a lot of issues that Mr. Trump has pushed aside. Has the market priced in a blue wave, and is the market willing to work with a more progressive, not the AOC program necessarily, but a more progressive program than we've seen in the last 4 years?
Right. I'm not a market person. There are other people on this panel that can talk about the pricing of the market. But one thing I can absolutely vouch, that CEOs of big companies, the Fortune 500, there's actually a Fortune conference starting today, are focused on much more ESGs than ever before. And I'm not talking about just the mathematics and the indices. I'm talking about a general wave amongst leadership in business today. As, for example, exhibited through the World Economic Forum, that businesses have a role to play that is beyond making money, that has to align with society. Employees are demanding this. Purpose is more important than ever before. So the bottom line is, I believe that business is going to be focused on the ESGs in one way or another. And I believe you will see within the next year or two much more reporting by companies of this kind of data.
Let me go right to Guy. Guy, you've just heard these comments by Stan. And of course, you have been incredibly progressive, both yourself personally and your company, in this regard, reaching out to talk about the larger issues that affect the community, affect the economy. Is Canada on a course, similar course in terms of the CEO community here?
Totally agree. I'm convinced it's a yes, and I'm pleased with the comments of Stan, and I 100% agree with what he just said. Not only because we are a co-op where we have members really involved in communities, long-term perspective, and we're making money, billions of dollars of net profit at the end of the years. But this concept of being in charge of more than only the net profit, I feel that more and more in Canada, people are having this discussion. Look at diversity. Look at environment, look at inequality in society. Even if Canada is a country where it's quite more positive than other countries, I think, around the globe. There has been a discussion like the one that we're having in the last 5-10 minutes in the last few years. And I totally agree with Stan. If we feel and if we think that our governments in the next decades will be able to fix all these social issues and business leaders will just take care of managing their companies, we will face so much problem in the future. Governments won't be able to fix education, health, poverty, roads, all these issues because of demographic, because of taxes, because of debt. We will need, as business leaders, to be more involved in communities and in the societies. And I'm totally convinced that the pressure will come from our clients, will come from our employees, will come from our investors. Yes, ESG criteria, because they will look at us and they will ask us, what are you doing for the society? Not only returns, but what are you doing? And I feel, yes, a cooperative, it's in our mindset, it's in our DNA for centuries. And you look at many cooperatives around the globe, they have been more resilient during crisis because they were having a long-term perspective in their decision process. They were really inclusive in the decision process, really democratic. And I really feel that, yes, people should learn from cooperative, but more and more I see a discussion like the one that Stan just started about what's the role of a company in the society and what's the purpose of what we want to achieve. And it's not just a slogan. It's not something that you just put on the wall. People, employees, clients will put more pressure on us in the next decades.
Yeah, I think you have wrapped up this discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time in a way that inspires all of us. I want to thank all the panel members, Stan and Guy Afsana and Governor. You've really contributed much to the start of the Toronto Global Forum. You've inspired me. I'm certainly going away feeling much more positive about the challenges in front of us than I was prior to the beginning of this panel. I mean, they're serious, they're sobering, they're large, but they're manageable if we again learn to pull together, work together, and adopt common cause for the common good. There's no contradiction between efficiency, effectiveness, profitability, and doing the right thing by our fellow man at the same time. And that's the message I think you've left all of us today, panelists. Thank you all very much.